Charles Worth established himself during the Second Empire in France. His clothing made Paris a showpiece. Worth tailored the Empress Eugenie in his shop. Her fashion set the style. He also designed for Empress Elizabeth of Austria. Worth thought that the crinoline skirt was unattractive, so he manipulated the style. As a result, the shape soon changed to a new trained, softer, bustled look, which only the rich found practical. By 1865, the wide crinoline-supported skirt was in its last phase. There was also a change to the bodice. The lace line had been rising a little above natural level during the 1860s. In evening dresses, the neckline changed from the deep, low curve over the shoulder to more of a square. Also in evening dresses, the sleeves disappear underneath the lace and ribbon which edged the neckline. In day dresses, bodices remained high and playing. However, by 1868, a square opening was beginning to appear with high chemisette of muslin or maybe a yoked effect with the trimming of a braid, fringed roaches, or a ribbon or lace. In day dresses, the sleeves are usually tight and plain in a jacket sleeve form. Epaulettes remained at the shoulder for a while, but then became rare after 1870. Now that there are sewing machines, lace is now machine-made and less hand-stitch embroidery is seen, and more machine embroidery is seen in accessories. Some dresses during this period were in the princess form. A princess form can be described as a dress with bodice and a skirt with a central of a diagonal fastening from the neck to the hem. In 1868, deep flounces at the bottom were becoming fashionable. Still framework in the skirts were now being replaced by horsehair bustles or petticoats. Trimming was used with great richness in the dresses of 1870s. The trimming gave the skirts or dresses form and character. The short-waisted bodice was worn less for the day dresses after 1870. By 1874, the front was extending well below the waist and was shaped to fit the figure closely. This was known as the cuirass bodice, and the neckline showed variety between 1870 and 1875. In the day dresses, the necklines were in a deep V that are often filled with chemise or of muslin, net, or lace. However, evening dresses had a low and square neckline, and this is the same for ball gowns. The fastening during this period continued to be in the front during the day, but in 1870, when the bodices began to have a jacket bodice, the fastening began to be in the back. The Polonaise form of the bodice of the dress extends to form the overskirt. This look resembles the 18th century dress form. Dolly Varden dresses were only used for informal occasions. They were made out of colored and striped cottons, and this would be used for summer wear. The colors during this time were always pale. They were shades of brown, gray, mauve, or blue. In 1868, trimming became more conspicuous and more elaborate in dresses. From 1869, flounces were found on almost all dresses. They were almost 9 inches below the heading and 3 inches below. Trimming was a huge characteristic of the time period. Bows, plain, or pipe lace trim were often added at every possible point in the dress, on the sleeves, at the center of the bodice, and at the end of the flounces. Evening dresses were trimmed with sprays of flowers in addition to flounces of muslin, net, or lace, or bows and ribbons. The greatest change was the cuirass bodice that appeared in 1874. The cuirass quality of the bodice was emphasized between 1875 through 1877 in a version that was sleeveless. Evening dresses between 1877 and 1882 were cut at a very low point in the back and the front, but curved high over the hips and the side. Skirts on most dresses were now so long in the back that they had to be lifted up for walking. The Polonaise of the early 1870s has a bodice with an attached skirt. By the late 1870s, the Polonaise are almost as long as the dress itself and resembles that of the princess dresses. And the princess dress appears in 1878 through 1880. 1875 and 1883, the skirts are starting to show no fullness at the sides and over the hips. In 1878, short dresses without trains begin to appear, and by 1880, trains disappear besides in evening dresses. And handkerchief dresses, in which the tunic fell in points over a narrow kilted or pleated skirt. The shaping of the skirt was given by a bustle in 1880 and began to increase in size until 1887, when the bustle starts to disappear by 1889. In the 1880s, the bustle had a narrower structure and hung down the center of the back and was made from horsehair and wire. For the rest of the period, generally, there is not a real skirt at all, but instead an application of drapery and trimming to a lining or a foundation. Lace still edged the draperies in some dresses, but lavish trimmings for the day dresses was over by 1885. Jabots of lace falling down the center of the bodice were fashionable in the mid-1880s, and sometimes lace cravats tied in a bow in the front were also fashionable. Sleeves were also as long to the wrist till 1883, but by 1889, sleeves transformed into puffs at the shoulders. By 1880, the stylish bodices fastened in the back and the waistcoat or plastron was made of different materials, but the colors remained the same. This is until the 1880s when the bodice becomes the most important part of the dress. Tea gowns in the 1870s were sometimes made of two different materials but of one shade. In the 1880s, tea gowns were worn a lot throughout the decade, and they grew to become more elaborate. In evening wear, the fabrics would be a combination of plain silk or velvet figured with a possible embroidered silk. By the late 1880s, the rich figured that materials such as velvet figured silks were fashionable. They then decided to combine the plain silk or satin. It was a period of rich colors and sometimes rather harsh colors and garish combinations, but from the 1880s there will become an equal amount of light shaded dresses which were commonly worn during the day. Blue, white, pink, red, and are often found in summer washing dresses. Many shades of blue were worn, particularly in the 1880s, and rich browns, chartreuse, and olive green, but rich wine or jewel-like shades of red remained dominant throughout the period. A suit composed with a coat stays pretty constant. A coat or cloak was added for an outerwear. Higher fastening on coats, particularly in lounge jackets, appear in the 1860s and 1870s. These jackets concealed much of the waistcoat. The waistcoat lengthened a little during the 1870s and 1880s and kept a horizontal line until the 1890s. After 1870, shirt fronts became very plain, and after 1880, the collar in all forms grew higher. By 1890s, the collar could stand from 2.5 to 3 inches high. This high collar appeared in both men and women's fashion. Ties twisted into a bow or knot became popular. These were made from many different fabrics and materials. By the 1890s, the ulster was worn with a half belt at the back only. Also in the 1890s, all coats were lengthened to the end between the calf and the ankle. Hats with dented crown and a curving brim, which in the 1890s was given the name the Triblee. These hats were usually made from a soft felt or straw. Soon jackets became brightly colored, and by the 1890s were known as blazers. White embroidered dresses continued to be worn in the 1870s and 1880s. The sleeves remained to be short until the 1890s, although for children of the ages between 4 and 5, sleeves were generally longer. Plaid dresses for both boys and girls under the age of 6 stayed fashionable from the beginning of the Victorian era till the 1870s. A narrow-brimmed straw hat was worn in the 1870s. In 1860s, the knickerbocker suits replaced the trousers for younger boys and were then worn by boys of the ages between 3 and 10. And then by the 1880s, trousers completely went out of style. Longer jackets replaced the short open jackets in the 1870s. The Harrow suit had a jacket that was pointed at the back and were generally worn by schoolboys in the 1880s and 1890s. Jersey material was occasionally worn in the 1860s and 1870s, but then became more popular in the 1880s. The Highland suit was also fashionable for young boys in the late 1860s and 1870s. By the 1880s, the sailor suit had developed style for boys, and it remained till the end of the century. This was commonly worn with sailor hats. However, by the 1880s, a round straw hat with turned-up brim were usually worn too. The dress continued to follow that of the women during the 1870s and 1880s. This could be a miniature overskirt with a looped and bustle effect of the 1870s. The straight-fronted dress with pleating and bows at the center back was seen in the 1880s. The material could be wool and silk, that is the same as the trimming of the pleated frills. By the 1870s, the dress had a high neckline with a standing collar. In the 1880s, girls started wearing loose-fitting dresses, falling full from the shoulder or a yoke, and they were usually held by a belt or was gathered by the band at the waist. These would be called blouses. Girls throughout the period wore some kind of apron or a pinafore to protect their dresses. White muslin sometimes trimmed the dresses and had frills or white embroidery. In the 1890s, the yoked style was more usual. The dresses of the 1880s tended to resemble that of their brothers and was not really a replica of their mother's fashions. In the 1890s, white cotton hats with a large flat crowns and a soft frilled brims were worn throughout the summers. Small bonnets continued to be in fashion until the 1870s. From 1867, hats were worn tilted forward or over the forehead. The small bonnets would rest flat on top of the head and had lace with flowers or ribbon at the front of the head. In 1871, the hairdressing became looser, but still remained complex and elaborate. High-crowned hats with turned-up brims will continue to be worn, and they normally did not have strings. From 1874, the upturned brims of the sailor or bonnets were trimmed with flowers. The high-crowned hats disappeared in the mid-1870s. In 1878, the Gainsborough, a round-crowned hat with a wide brim turned up at one side, continued to be popular through the 1880s. In the 1870s and in the 1880s, whole birds as well as parts of birds began appearing and were used as trimming for bonnets. Straw hats and bonnets were still worn throughout the 1880s. In the mid-1880s, bonnet crowns grew higher, and by the early 1880s, bonnets were beginning to be edged with beads, ribbons, feathers, and flowers. By 1890, bonnets were also so small that they would become hidden behind their trimmings of bows, ribbons, flowers, feathers, or lace. By 1880s and the 1890s, the stitching on the backs of hands of the gloves were often very heavy. Suede gloves appeared in the 1860s and had become very fashionable by the 1880s. Silk gloves in the 1880s were beginning to be called silk jersey gloves. By the 1860s, the fan was generally fashionable, and by 1870, the fan was once more universally used. In the 1870s, they usually had heavy sticks and varied in shapes. The leaves were usually silk or satin and were often trimmed with lace and were sometimes embroidered or painted. Some were even trimmed with feathers. Feather fans became more popular in the 1870s. Ostrich fans became into fashion in the late 1880s and continued throughout the 1890s. In the 1870s, fans were sometimes worn suspended from a cord that was around the waist, and some had a short cord with a tassel. A bow or ribbon often replaced the cord or tassel in the 1880s. Also in the 1880s, fans got a lot bigger and were sometimes 14 through 16 inches long. The handles of parasols continued to be short and thick during the 1870s, but then became larger, though still rather heavy in the 1880s. Heads of animals and birds often decorated the parasols in the 1870s and 1880s. Covers with ruched trimming were popular in the 1880s. Deep lace awnings were also fashionable in the 1870s and 1880s, and they grew longer and appeared slimmer when closed.